Hi, I'm Amy Cardoso and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Menil Collection, and our interviewer, Kristen Cochran, speaks with curator Michelle White about the exhibition, Niki de Saint Phalle in the 1960s. Now for Art This Week.
I'm Kristen Cochran, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with curator Michelle White in the exhibition Niki de Saint Phalle in the 1960s. Michelle, I'm really excited to talk to you about this exhibition and to share more with our audience about Niki's work. Thank you for being here with me today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for coming.
Good. So I'm just going to start off with an introductory question and ask you to give a brief overview. What's on view? Maybe you want to think chronologically or how a person moves through the space, and then why are the 1960s particularly important for her work and development, and maybe how are they relevant? How is the work from the 60s relevant to our time today? It's a lot packed in there.
That's a lot, but it's a big show. So the exhibition looks at the work of the French-American artist from the 1960s, and it's such a radical, incredibly important moment for the artist. It's the beginning of her career, and it's a decade where she's extremely experimental and political in forming what will become her career-long interest in particular themes, specifically themes of violence, patriarchal violence specifically, and kind of confronting how the female body has been represented in the history of art. So the exhibition sort of takes us through her work chronologically in these 10 years, beginning very early with some of her earliest works as an artist when she was in Paris. And I want to start by talking about the Dart portrait, which begins the show. And this is an incredible work, and it's among a series of portraits she did of former lovers, where she would render their likeness with objects and materials specific to them. So for example, the work on view has a white shirt, and you can see the label Saks Fifth Avenue. Yep. And what she did with these portraits when she first displayed them in a museum is that she would put a table filled with darts in front of the work, and you, the viewer, could come in and you were invited to participate in lodging these sharp objects against, the visage of her former lover. And this was really important for Saint Phalle's trajectory, because essentially it opened up this idea of how she could begin to think about audience participation in the creation of the work of art. So when we move into the next gallery, it's 1961. And what she does so brilliantly is that she replaces the darts with essentially a bullet, and begins to ask the audience to participate in creating the work of art by using a gun. And that takes us to the beginnings of this show, which are the shooting paintings, also known as the tiers. And it's a group of work that she does for about 3 years that essentially has the same format, where she's taking a kind of hard surface and using the technique of assemblage and bringing together a variety of found objects, domestic objects, industrial objects, bits of metal, shoes, and within that composition also taking containers of pigment, often little baggies of pigment or jars of pigment that she would then embed in the surface and cover with a layer of white plaster. So when she did shoot the work, the bits of color would splatter and drip very spectacularly and very colorfully against the surface of the work.
And as a matter of fact, all the critics were against me, except my fellow artists. Bob Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, they were all great fans of mine. And they loved shooting. There I am with Ed Kienholz. He was wonderful to me. He helped me enormously with my painting. We just argued about one thing. I didn't care what gun I used, and he wanted me to have about 12 guns and to make a procession bringing all the guns in. Whereas for me, the gun was an instrument. I loved Ed. He was a marvelous sculptor and a marvelous man. I shot because it was fun, and it made me feel great. I shot because I was fascinated watching the paint bleed and die.
This is wonderful. So you've mentioned color, you've talked a little bit about materials, a bit about process, how the process was particularly violent and physical, how it implicated others into this sort of violent act. A couple things that you touched upon was the target, and also thinking about how the paint is used, how it drips and sort of oozes. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about her relationship to other artists like Jackson Pollock's Drips and Skins, what she knew about Jackson Pollock, how she might have been informed by his work, or vice versa, how he might have been informed by her work in sort of a strange way. But also thinking about Jasper Johns and his targets, and sort of, I know that she was friends, that there was a very collegial environment with Tangley, and she knew Rauschenberg well. And so, yeah, if we can talk specifically about relationships with other artists, how about Johns and Pollock in particular, how they influenced her work?
Sure. So, you know, Saint Phalle's biography is really fascinating because she's an artist with ties to both sides of the Atlantic. And as a result, she was affiliated with avant-garde circles both in Europe and the United States. And it's pretty unique. And in both of those circles, of course, Jackson Pollock is such an important figure that all of these artists in the late 50s into the early 1960s are responding to. So when Saint Phalle first started making the shooting paintings, she was certainly aware of Jackson Pollock. The artist had died about 4 to 5 years earlier, and especially in Europe, Pollock was only known within popular kind of circles and within artistic circles as a result of a group of touring exhibitions that happened in the late 1950s. I think it was 1959. So many artists would have seen Pollock for the first time at the moment Niki de Saint Phalle starts making her work. So it's certainly someone that she was turning to, but also immediately thinking about how to challenge. And for Saint Phalle and so many artists in this generation, Pollock was both a figure to revere, but also one to sort of think about how to move forward. And when Saint Phalle first started making the shooting paintings, you know, she recalled that immediately she saw that this was, in fact, making a type of Jackson Pollock with very untraditional means. When art critics, including Pierre Restany, first saw her work when she was making it in Paris, you know, he threw up his hands and said, "This is, you know, painting au revolver." So he immediately linked what she was doing to the legacy of Jackson Pollock. And it was that declaration then that he invited her to become a part of the circle of the Nouveau Realists in Paris. So that circle included artists Jean Tinguely, Armand, Christo, and Yves Klein, among others. And it's certainly one way of seeing how her production was a part of this group of artists that were equally, you know, just fascinated with notions of destruction as this paradoxical way of creating. But then we also have, and let's go back to your other question, let's go back to the United States. So Saint Phalle is raised in the United States. She grew up in New York City. So certainly the backdrop of this moment in art history was incredibly formative, and not just for Jackson Pollock, but also in how she was developing these questions and themes of her work related to masculine violence. You know, her use of the gun, for example, is very much tied to her critique of American masculinity. but it also, of course, brought her close to so many American artists within the avant-garde, and that included Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. So for both of those artists, she developed a close relationship with them in around 1961. At the time, she was exhibiting in many important exhibitions with the artists, but she also began collaborating with them. And I think one of the most important relationships she had that I really hope to bring forward in the research we've done for the exhibition publication is with Robert Rauschenberg. And what's incredible, between like 1961 and 1964, they are showing in so many exhibitions together. And not only that, Rauschenberg is participating in many of her shooting paintings.
Okay, so before we move on, I would love to talk a little bit about how, like, the titles of the two bodies of work that are on view, the Tears and the Nanas. I think they're really packed with some great humor and relate to her dual identity as a French-American artist.
Yes, certainly she loved language play and this slippage between English and French. And I think we can see that right away in the use of the word tir, T-I-R, which often refers to her shooting paintings. Of course, it means to shoot in French, but when you start to think about it in the English language, we can think about tear, we can think about kind of rips in the fabrics of tradition itself, or sort of shooting through the surface of the work. We can think about tear, you know, the secretion from your eye when you're sad, and how that kind of relates to particularly emotional states for her. So I think there's a lot of kind of ways to interpret how she's titling series, and that relates as well to the Nanas. And of course, the Nanas are a series that will dominate her career into the 70s, 80s, and 90s of these female figures, which she first begins creating in 1964. So Nana, you know, itself is a complicated word. In English, we can kind of think about like a familiar term for our grandmother, or a kind of motherly figure, but also it's a term in French that kind of has this kind of pejorative sense of kind of chick, a whore, a kind of loose woman, so to speak, within that language and within the terminology and its use in the 1960s. And for Saint Phalle, that kind of duality of how women were represented in art history, how women were treated in society as kind of this complex figure poised between complicated gender roles, was really important. And we see that too in this series of works that anticipate the Nanas that we have on view. And that includes kind of these female bodies that are represented in various stereotypical posturing that the artist very much felt confined women. So we have a bride, and she's very much kind of wrapped and confined in her veil.
Yes.
We have a kind of goddess image of a woman, and she's giving birth to a team of trampling white stallions, which is remarkable. We also have the Marilyn Monroe figure, which in itself is quite complicated. And the one piece from the Pompidou in Paris, which we're really excited to have on view, represents a figure that's both a kind of maternal figure in curlers, but also one in provocative lingerie that specifically references a sex worker.
There's some language play in terms of her titling, and I also think she plays with material language in a really interesting way. And so if you could talk a little bit about her choice of materials, maybe specifically in the early reliefs and the Tears reliefs and tableaus, what's she choosing to work with? And are these choices perhaps political or social in nature?
Yeah, I mean, one aspect of her production at this time that we're really hoping to pull out in a way that really hasn't been done before in scholarship is her relationship to this kind of larger sort of trend of assemblage that was happening in Europe and the United States in the late 1950s and into the 1960s. So what you'll see especially in the first half of the exhibition, that she's not only shooting the work with a gun and creating these like spectacular effects of paint splattering, she's also doing that against incredibly elaborate narratives that are told through the use of everyday materials. And in 1961, when she starts doing this, of course this is political. One, it's certainly engaged in this larger sort of discourse in contemporary art of questioning tradition by bringing in everyday stuff. This is the collision of art and life. This is exactly what Robert Rauschenberg is talking about, Klaus Oldenburg, that bringing in everyday detritus is sort of confronting the rarefied language of art history. So by taking these objects, pairs of old shoes, toilet plumbing, and bringing that into the composition is incredibly political and radical at the time.
I want to ask you some more open-ended questions. I'm thinking specifically about the roles of trauma and conversely, the role of joy in the work. And I think this can relate specifically to this earlier body of work, Tears, and the later body of work that we're surrounded by, which are the Nanas. So however you want to answer that question, trauma and joy as either motivating forces in the work or maybe even formal strategies.
Right, no, I mean, it's such an interesting way of seeing how this show is split between these very violent works and these very joyful works. But I think this notion of paradox is really at the core of her shooting paintings. You have to say there's a lot of pleasure that you can read in these works. In fact, Saint Phalle often talked about kind of watching people take such great pleasure and joy and satisfaction in watching the paint kind of splatter and bleed on the surface. But conversely, of course, it's an incredibly violent act. And one way we can understand this is in terms of the work's historical context. Saint Phalle was working in Europe. This is against the backdrop of a place dealing with the aftermath of World War II and quite literal destruction. And like so many artists of her generation working in Europe, this notion of destruction, of destroying the picture plane, of slashing it, of burning it, as a strategy of creation was certainly a response to the time and the place. And I'll also say another way we can certainly understand her approach to artistic creation through such a violent act is also against the backdrop of the Cold War. And it's what was happening in the headlines at the time was something that Saint Phalle was certainly aware of and would discuss, especially in the themes we can see in the larger tiers that showcase these prehistoric beast-trampling cities. And for the artist, this is certainly aligned with this new threat in the world of nuclear annihilation. And her use of these beasts, which are these Godzilla figures, are very much a metaphor of atomic warfare. To push that further, the primary way Saint Phalle's work has been interpreted in art history is very personally. In the late 1990s, Saint Phalle made public that she was a victim of sexual violence and abuse as a child. And it's thus become one way, certainly, of understanding how she's thinking about assaulting the patriarchy through her formal decisions about how to create a painting, how to create a work of art. But one thing we were really thinking through when we were conceiving this exhibition is to not necessarily erase that history or not consider it as fundamental to her work, but also to pull in her artistic strategy into a much larger conversation happening within avant-garde production.
Okay.
But certainly destruction is there, violence is there, both personally and historically. So when we come into the second half of the gallery, there's so much joy that is also equally, if not more, political. These are female bodies doing whatever they want, that are sort of free from the confines of the bridal veil, for example, and kind of establishing their own space.
Yes.
And taking up space in the world, more specifically with kind of bold, unabashed, abandoned.
Yes.
And I've often, as I've been taking people through the show, I started thinking about this idea that once you destroy the patriarchy, you're going to have to make a matriarchy. And in many ways, we can think of her repeated use of the Nana figure as essentially kind of creating a new matriarchal society.
Speaking specifically about the Nanas, it reminds me of this this anecdote where Gloria Steinem sees Niki de Saint Phalle in New York. And from what I remember, she's wearing a cowboy hat and a trench coat, and she has no purse. And so Steinem sort of declares that she's the first free woman, which I think is just, it's a wonderful story and visual. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about this idea of freedom as it relates to any of the work, but maybe specifically to this later work in the 60s, the Nanas.
I know, isn't it a wonderful quote? And I think it says so much about not only how Saint Phalle operated in the world, but how she intended the Nanas to have a presence, and have a presence that was about taking space. You know, what I love about that quote is I think it paints a picture of how she intended the Nanas to operate in the world, to take up space, to sort of be unhindered from gender stereotypes. And, you know, as we go through and look at the postures of the Nanas, you know, they're you know, doing karate kicks in the air, their hands are above their head, they're painted with bold colors and graphic design. And I always have been pointing out that when you look at these undulating curves and these bold colors, we're also in the 1960s. This is the height of minimalism, and certainly how she's very garishly decorating these female figures are an incredibly specific and critical attack of sort of primary modes of art making at this time. These are women not just like doing whatever they want, but these are women that are very much confronting the art historical norm in the 1960s. And certainly this notion of radical joy is so important. The idea of liberation, the idea of a free female body that's not tied to a purse, as Gloria Steinem pointed out, is so important to think about early feminist art production in this decade, but also as we are thinking about the relevance of this work now, it's certainly something to think about how her early questioning of what a free female body means in the world is very much at the fore of our own kind of political discourses in 2021, which is still remarkable.
I know that some of the works on view in this exhibition are in your permanent collection, in the Menil permanent collection. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship Niki had with the Menil family.
Sure. I mean, one of the reasons we wanted to do this show was to highlight that Saint Phalle is an artist with ties to this collection and the de Menil family. The de Menils acquired some of her work really early on, in fact, from her first New York show in 1962, and very much went on to support her projects throughout her career, including some major outdoor work towards the end of the 1960s. And you know, one part of this exhibition we're really excited about comprises material that we've pulled together from our library, drawing collection, and archives. And through an array of materials, from everything from her first brochure for her exhibition in Paris in 1961 to personal correspondence with the de Menils, it really highlights not only the sort of close relationship she had with the de Menils, but how much their support and conversation reveals about the work from this time.
Wonderful. I think that's a great place to end. And thank you so much for the conversation today.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
We want to thank Michelle for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to menil.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching. Find all of our videos and sign up for our newsletter at artthisweek.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.